Stand at the foot of the hill and look up. The building crowns the ridge like a cathedral of medicine, a quarter-mile of brick and stone, symmetrical to the inch, its central tower rising above a town that paid for every course of masonry. In the 19th century, this was what a society did with its faith in progress. It built. Between 1840 and 1900, Britain, America, and the continent raised hundreds of these monumental hospitals and asylums, and they raised them tall, ordered, and deliberately visible. A hospital was not meant to hide. It was meant to reassure. These were not warehouses for the sick. They were arguments in architecture, the conviction that the right building could cure. Every decision carried a claim. The elevation on the hilltop caught cleaner air and drained bad water downhill. The long wings reached toward sunlight. The ornament announced that the poor and the mad were worth a palace. Netley's Royal Victoria Hospital, opened in 1863, ran a facade a quarter of a mile long above Southampton Water. Greystone Park in New Jersey would eventually enclose the largest continuous floor area of any building in America until the Pentagon. Money followed conviction. Legislatures voted enormous sums. Counties competed to build grander than their neighbors. Architects like Thomas Story Kirkbride and reformers like Florence Nightingale were treated not as decorators, but as physicians in stone, prescribing corridors and window ratios the way a doctor prescribes a drug. The building itself was the treatment. And that is the paradox this film will trace. The very features that made these places monuments, the vast footprint, the ornamental scale, the wings stretched thin to chase light and moving air, were engineered for a theory of disease that medicine was about to overturn. Every foot of corridor built to heal would, a century later, become a foot of corridor impossible to heat, to wire, to bring up to code. The palace on the hill was designed with total confidence in one idea about why people got sick. To understand the building, you first have to understand that idea, and it began with the air itself. The idea was called miasma, the belief that disease rose from foul air. Not germs, which no one could yet see, but stench, the invisible poison of rotting matter, stagnant water, and crowded, unwashed bodies. If bad air made you sick, then good air would make you well. Cure the atmosphere, and you cure the patient. No one pressed that logic harder than Florence Nightingale. Returning from the Crimean War, where she had watched more soldiers die of infection in the wards than of wounds on the field, she published Notes on Hospitals in 1859. Its argument was blunt. A hospital should do the sick no harm. Overcrowding killed. Stale air killed. The remedy was space, light, and a constant, deliberate current of moving air washing through every ward. From that conviction came a specific shape, the pavilion plan. Instead of one dense block, the hospital was broken into separate wings, or pavilions, linked by open corridors, and set apart so that air and sunlight could reach every side. Each pavilion held a single long room, the Nightingale ward. Picture it. 20 to 30 beds per side, ranged along the walls with tall windows between them, roughly one window for every 2 beds. Ceilings 15 feet high. Beds spaced a strict 8 feet apart, a full one, 200 to 2,000 cubic feet of air allotted to each patient. Fireplaces or open flues at the center pulled draft from end to end. The nurse stood at the head of the ward and saw every face at once. Cross ventilation ran wall to wall. The windows were meant to be opened even in winter. The building breathed on purpose. This was not comfort, it was prescription. The width of the ward, the height of the glass, the distance between beds, each was a dose, calculated in cubic feet. It worked well enough to become doctrine. Across 2 continents, the long, thin ward chasing light and air became the default anatomy of the hospital. And when reformers turned to the hardest cases, the asylums for the insane, one American physician would take the same faith in architecture and stretch it further than anyone. His name was Thomas Story Kirkbride, and in 1854 he published a book that would shape the American asylum for half a century, on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane. Kirkbride believed that madness could be treated by order, that a well-run building, full of light and calm, could restore a disordered mind. He called it moral treatment, and he wrote its principles into a floor plan. The Kirkbride plan had a signature silhouette, a central administrative core with wings stepping outward on each side in a shallow V, each wing set slightly back from the last. The staggering was not decoration. It meant that no wing blocked another's light or air. Every ward received sunlight and cross-ventilation on multiple sides. The most agitated patients were housed farthest out, the calmest nearest the center. As a patient improved, they were moved physically closer to the middle, recovery measured in the length of a corridor. The scale was staggering. A single Kirkbride building could run a third of a mile from wingtip to wingtip. Buttressed and towered, they looked like Gothic castles set in landscaped parks, grounds often designed by men like Frederick Law Olmsted, who laid out Central Park. The parkland was part of the prescription too. Sweeping lawns, curving drives, and long views were thought to soothe. Kirkbride even specified the maximum patient count, 250, later stretched to 600, because he believed a doctor could not know more faces than that. Between the 1850s and the 1890s, dozens rose across the United States: Danvers in Massachusetts, Buffalo State in New York, Greystone Park, and Trenton in New Jersey, Weston in West Virginia. Each was a small kingdom of therapeutic architecture, where sunlight, sightline, and view were dispensed like medicine down hundreds of feet of hallway. But a building that treats hundreds cannot stand alone. It has to be fed, heated, watered, laundered, and buried. A population the size of a town, sealed on a hilltop miles from the nearest one. To house that many souls, the asylum had to stop being a building at all and become something closer to a city. By the time it was full, the great asylum was not a hospital. It was a settlement of 2, 3, even 4,000 people who ate, worked, worshipped, and died without passing through the front gate. And like any settlement, it had to sustain itself. So it grew its own food. Most institutions ran working farms, hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 acres of fields, dairy herds, piggeries, and orchards, tended by the patients themselves as part of their treatment and as free labor. Willardton, New York, farmed on a scale that fed thousands. Kings Park on Long Island ran its own farm colony, its own pier, and eventually its own railroad spur to bring in coal. Because coal was the lifeblood. Under the wards ran the real machinery of the place. A central powerhouse with rows of boilers burning tons of coal a day, pushing steam through miles of underground tunnels to heat every distant wing. Those tunnels, brick-lined, pipe-hung, running for a mile or more beneath the campus, carried not just heat, but laundry carts, food, and staff. So the work of the institution never stopped for weather. Above ground rose the supporting city, a water tower and reservoir, a laundry washing thousands of sheets a week, kitchens, a bakery, a chapel, workshops, a morgue, a fire brigade, and staff cottages for the doctors who lived on site. Many had their own cemeteries, the graves marked not with names, but with numbers. A patient could arrive, live for 40 years, and be buried without ever crossing the property line. This self-sufficiency was the whole point. It made the institution a monument, a demonstration that society could enclose its most difficult members in a complete, ordered, self-running world. But it also made the institution enormous, specialized, and staggeringly expensive to run. Every acre of farm, every mile of tunnel, every ton of coal was a fixed cost, sized for a permanent population of thousands. And that arithmetic held only so long as the ward stayed full, so long as medicine still believed the answer to illness was a long stay behind these walls. That belief was about to break. The ward stayed full only because medicine had nothing faster to offer. Then, in a few decades, it found everything. It began with a discovery the miasma theorists never saw coming. In the 1860s and 1870s, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that specific diseases were caused not by bad air, but by specific microorganisms, germs. Cure the germ, and the atmosphere no longer mattered. Joseph Lister, applying the idea, introduced carbolic acid antisepsis in 1867, and the open, airy ward, designed to flush away miasma, began to give way to the sealed, sterile operating theater, where the enemy was contamination, not stench. The pace only quickened. Surgery, made survivable by anesthesia and antisepsis, moved illness from the long-stay ward to the operating table, and a short recovery. Then came the drugs. Insulin in 1922. Penicillin, discovered in 1928 and mass-produced in the 1940s, turned infections that once meant weeks in bed into a course of pills. A patient who might have occupied a Nightingale ward for a month now left in days. For the asylums, the turning point had a date, 1952, when a French drug called chlorpromazine, sold as Thorazine, became the first effective antipsychotic. For the first time, the symptoms Kirkbride had tried to calm with sunlight and corridors could be calmed with a tablet. The building was no longer the treatment. The pill was. Consider what that did to the logic of the place. Every one of these institutions had been built on a single premise, that healing required a long stay inside a very particular kind of architecture. Wide wards for air, staggered wings for light, a self-contained city to hold patients for years. Germ theory, antisepsis, antibiotics, and antipsychotics dismantled that premise piece by piece. The cure was now portable. It fit in a syringe, a scalpel tray, a bottle on a shelf. The vast campuses did not become useless overnight, but their reason for existing had quietly evaporated. They were monuments to a medical idea that no longer held, thousands of beds waiting for patients whom medicine no longer needed to keep. Soon, a new philosophy would decide those patients should not be kept at all, and the emptying would begin. In 1955, America's public asylums reached their high water mark. 558,000 residents, a population larger than Milwaukee, packed into wards built for order and air. Nobody planned for the number to fall. Then it collapsed. Chlorpromazine, sold as Thorazine from 1954, quieted symptoms that had once justified a lifetime indoors. Suddenly, a patient who might have stayed 40 years could be discharged in 40 weeks. In 1961, Britain's Health Minister Enoch Powell stood before the National Association for Mental Health and delivered his water tower speech, pointing at the very buildings this film has admired. Isolated, majestic, imperious, and promising to empty them. 2 years later, in 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, pledging a network of 500 local centers to replace the monumental hospitals. Fewer than half were ever built. The money moved anyway. When Medicaid arrived in 1965, it would pay for care in a nursing home or a general ward, but not in a state asylum. A single accounting rule that made discharge cheaper than treatment. States that spent millions heating their hilltop campuses discovered they could shift the cost to Washington by simply opening the doors. And so the wards emptied, faster than anyone had imagined. The U.S. asylum census fell from 558,000 to under 130,000 by 1980, and below 72,000 by 1990, a 9/10 collapse in a single working lifetime. In Britain, the great county asylums that had each held 2,000 or 3,000 souls dwindled to a few hundred, then to skeleton wards behind locked corridors. Frerne, once Colney Hatch, had run the longest hospital corridor in Europe. Now it echoed. The farm stopped. The laundries went quiet. The boiler houses, sized to warm a small town, burned coal for a handful of remaining patients. A campus designed to be self-sufficient for thousands cannot shrink gracefully to serve dozens. It can only hollow. The purpose had drained out of the architecture, leaving the architecture behind, vast, specific, and suddenly unaffordable. The obvious question was whether these palaces could simply be made into modern hospitals. The answer, everywhere, was no. So why not simply modernize? On paper, a solid Victorian hospital looks like a gift. Thick masonry walls, generous rooms, land to spare. In practice, every virtue of the pavilion plan became a defect the moment medicine changed. The Nightingale ward had been built long and thin, sometimes 120 feet, so that air could cross from window to window. Modern medicine wanted the opposite. Deep floor plates where an operating suite, imaging, recovery, and supply could sit side by side, minutes apart. You cannot cut a wide theater out of a corridor 28 feet across without demolishing the walls that hold the roof up. Then came the codes. A ward reached by a single grand staircase failed every fire regulation written after 1945. Hospitals now required enclosed fire stairs, sprinklers, smoke compartments, and 2 protected means of escape from every floor. Buildings raised for the horse and cart era had no lifts capable of carrying a modern bed and its equipment, and dropping a lift shaft through 4 floors of load-bearing brick meant threading steel through a structure that resisted every hole. Heating and cooling were worse. The genius of these hospitals had been that they breathed on their own. Sealing them for mechanical ventilation meant running miles of duct through ceilings never designed to hide it, chasing pipe through 15-inch walls. And the fabric itself was hostile. Decades of lagging, floor tile, and fireproofing had been laid in asbestos. A full strip-out could cost more than the building was worth before a single patient moved in. Above all, there was the running cost. Heating a quarter-mile of single-story ward with heat pouring out of the very windows that once cured people was an expense no health budget could carry. Estimates for bringing a large asylum to modern acute standard routinely ran past the cost of building new on a cheaper site. The arithmetic was merciless, and it pointed one way. So the boards did the math, closed the files, and walked away. And once the doors were locked, a slower demolition began on its own. Abandonment is not a pause, it is a process. The moment the heat went off and the last watchman left, the buildings began to die in a predictable order. Rain found the flat valleys and parapet gutters first, then the plaster, then the floor joists. Pipes burst in the first hard winter. Copper and lead vanished, stripped by scavengers who tore out ceilings to reach it. Windows went next, thousands of them. And with the windows gone, the weather moved indoors. Then came the fires. Empty asylums burned again and again, some by accident, many by arson. A single blaze could take a wing that would have cost millions to save. At Netley, the vast Royal Victoria Military Hospital on Southampton Water, its facade a quarter of a mile long, once visited by Queen Victoria herself, a fire in 1963 gutted the center, and in 1966 the wrecking crews finished what the flames began, leaving only the chapel standing in an empty park. In Massachusetts, Danvers State Hospital, the very Kirkbride that inspired a genre of horror, sat rotting for 2 decades until, in 2006, most of it was pulled down for apartments. A year later, during construction, fire destroyed part of the new build too, as if the site refused to be tamed. At Greystone Park in New Jersey, where Woody Guthrie had been a patient, the enormous Kirkbride main building, one of the largest continuous foundations in America, was demolished in 2015 over the protests of preservationists who had fought for years. The pattern repeated across 2 countries, Overbrook, Byberry, Whittingham, Cane Hill. Neglect, not policy, wrote the final verdict. No board ever had to vote to destroy these places. Time, water, and fire did the voting, and the bulldozer merely certified the result. It was cheaper to demolish than to secure, cheaper to secure than to repair, and cheaper to walk away than any of it. And yet, here and there, a few of these giants were caught before the end, and their survival tells us exactly what saving one required. Not every giant fell. A handful were saved, and each survivor teaches the same lesson. Rescue came only when someone found a new use vast enough to fill the space. In Buffalo, the Richardson Olmsted Complex, Designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, its twin towers, rising over grounds laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted, opened in 1880, sat empty for decades before a state grant of $100 million stabilized the shell. In 2017, its central building reopened as Hotel Henry, a boutique hotel and conference center. The long Kirkbride wards, once prescriptions of light and air, became guest rooms that sold the same light and air as luxury. In North London, Fern Hospital, the former Colney Hatch with that record-breaking corridor, was converted in the 1990s into Princess Park Manor, gated apartments where the wards that had held the destitute now sell for millions. Others found narrower escapes. Parts of Danvers survived as housing. The Athens Asylum in Ohio became a university arts center. Minston, Whittingham fragments, and a scattering of English county asylums live on as flats, colleges, and film sets. But notice what every rescue required: enormous capital, a buyer who wanted acres of period grandeur, and a use, hotel, luxury housing, campus, that could absorb a quarter-mile of ward. Where those three things met, a building lived. Where anyone was missing, the bulldozer won. That is the quiet tragedy of these places. They were not destroyed because they were ugly or hated or worthless. They were destroyed because they were too big to heat, too specific to repurpose, too grand to demolish cheaply, and too vast for any single ordinary use to justify. The very ambition that raised them, the faith that architecture itself could cure, is what left them stranded when medicine walked out the door. The palace on the hill was always a monument to hope. It was also, in the end, a monument to scale. And that is the whole story of the Old World Hospital, written in brick and loss. Built to heal, too vast to save,